It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Miriam Schoenfield, or Schoenfield. Always wanted to know how exactly. The second. From New York University, author of important papers on imprecise credences, rational belief and higher order evidence. And the title of her talk is Beliefs Formed Arbitrarily. Miriam, please.
Thank you so much. So before I begin, I just wanted to give a little background about some of the terminology that I'm going to be using during the talk for those who are not familiar with it. So I'm going to be talking a lot about the accuracy of credences or probabilities. And the way to think about accuracy as applied to credences is as follows. You can think of accuracy is to credence as truth is to belief. So we want our beliefs to be true. If I have a 0.7 probability that it's going to rain, and it rains, my probability wasn't true or false. That doesn't make sense. But we can say that it was pretty accurate, whereas if I was 0.6, I would be less accurate, and if I was at 0.1, I'd be even less accurate. So in general, if P is true, the higher my credence, the more accurate it is. Whereas if P is false, the higher my credence, the less accurate it is. Okay. Now, people have gone about assigning various credences accuracy scores. So, for example, say I have a credence of 0.7 in P, and P is true. Then this might represent the accuracy of a 0.7 credence in P when P is true, and that might get some score. The scores are between 0 and 1. So I'm just going to make one up. Let's suppose this gets the score 0.82, because that's pretty good, whereas a 0.6 would get a lower score when P is true, maybe 0.75. Okay. The other notion that I'm going to appeal to is the notion of expected accuracy. So say I'm at 0.7, but Tom is at 0.6, and I want to think about how accurate I expect Tom to be. So the expected accuracy of Tom's 0.6 credence relative to my 0.7 credence is going to be, I'm going to think, well, there's a 70% chance that Tom gets the accuracy score of 0.6 when P is true, because I think there's a 70% chance P is true. There's a 30% chance he gets the accuracy score of 0.6 when P is false. Okay, so that's expected accuracy. And then the last notion is immodesty. So immodesty is a feature of certain ways of assigning these scores. And on immodest ways of measuring accuracy, every probability function is such that this expected accuracy quantity is maximized by itself. In other words, if I'm at 0.7, I'm going to assign 0.7 higher expected accuracy than any other credence. That's why it's called immodesty, because credences are self-recommended from an expected accuracy perspective. Many of the beliefs that are very fundamental to who we are and how we structure our lives have been heavily socially influenced, especially when it comes to matters like religion, morality, politics. It's very likely that if we'd grown up somewhere else or been subject to different social influences, we'd see the world very differently. A lot of people are disturbed by the fact that there's some sense in which it's arbitrary that they have the beliefs that they do. This is the concern I'm going to be talking about today. Okay. So for the purposes of this talk, to regard a belief as formed arbitrarily is to regard which belief one ends up with as independent of how things are. So we can think about this as regarding the probability that I form the belief that P conditional on P is the same as the probability that I form the belief that P conditional on not P, and vice versa. Okay. Also, for today, I'm going to talk about any degree of confidence you have that's greater than 0.5 as a belief. That's not substantive, it's purely stipulative, so I can talk under the heading of beliefs formed arbitrarily about a whole cluster of asymmetrical favorings towards P. Okay. So I want to say a little bit about the methodology that I'm using here because it's a bit unconventional. So I'm not going to be giving any arguments, at least straightforwardly, for claims about which way of responding to this information is rational or whether it's possible to have knowledge in these sorts of cases. Instead, I'm just going to tell you how I've come to think about beliefs formed arbitrarily in my own case. The reasons for this will become clear later, I promise. But before you run out of the room thinking I came here for Epistemic Rationality Conference, not autobiography, especially since the autobiography is not correct, I want to say a little bit now about why you might find this interesting. Okay. So here's the first reason you might find it interesting. If you're the kind of person that has concerns in your own case about arbitrarily formed belief, it might be that seeing my demonstration, so you can think of what I'm doing as demonstrating a way of navigating these concerns, might lead you to come up with new ways of navigating your own concerns. I take this to be at least part of what Descartes was doing in his meditations. He was giving a demonstration about how someone who was beset with doubt could fish themselves out of the skeptical quicksand. Okay. But if you're thinking, I don't have these concerns myself, I'm just interested in rationality, I'm a theorist, I'm a philosopher, that's okay too, because the considerations I raise here can, I believe, be used to give arguments about what's rational. But what those arguments will be is going to depend on your other theoretical commitments. So if I have time at the end, I'll say a little bit about how that might go. Okay. So first, meditation. I want to start by talking about some toy cases that are based on cases from Roger White. So here's the first case. Perceptual coin flip. One fair coin will determine whether the wall will be painted red or blue. Another fair coin will determine whether it will appear to me that the wall is red or it will appear to me that the wall is blue. If I expect that in a case like perceptual coin flip, I'm going to form a belief about the color of the wall on the basis of perception, I'm going to regard that belief as formed arbitrarily, because I'm going to think which belief I end up with is independent of what the color of the wall actually is. What belief I end up with is going to be determined by one coin flip. The color of the wall is going to be determined by another coin flip. So I regard these two things as probabilistically independent. Logic coin flip. One fair coin determines whether I'll be given a logic problem whose premises entail P, or a logic problem whose premises entail not P. The flip of a second fair coin will determine whether I come up with a proof that seems to me to show that the premises entail P, or I come up with a proof that seems to me to show that the premises entail not P. Whatever answer I come up with, double checking is going to yield the same result. Here too, I think if I'm going to form a belief on the basis of my logical reasoning, I'm going to regard that belief as arbitrarily formed, because which belief I form is determined by one coin flip. What kind of problem I'm given is determined by another coin flip. Okay, so when I was contemplating these cases, I found myself averse to the idea of forming a belief in cases like that. I thought forming a belief in these cases, not a good idea. I was trying to think about why I had this aversion to forming beliefs in cases like this. And in thinking about this, I found it helpful to think about what it is that I want out of my beliefs. In my own case, what I want out of my beliefs is that they be true, that my credences be accurate. So I want an accurate picture of the way the world is. But when I thought that, it occurred to me that it's not so obvious why having a concern with truth would motivate an aversion to forming beliefs in these cases. So take perceptual coin flip. It's true that if I expect to form a belief, I'll think there's a 50% chance I'll end up with a false belief. And that's pretty bad, given that I care about the truth. But there's also a 50% chance that I'll end up with a true belief. Whereas if I just stick to my 0.5 credence, I'm taking a risk-averse option. I'm not going to get any falsehoods, but I'm not going to get any truths either. In my practical life, I don't have a really strong preference for my current monetary state over a gamble which gives me 50% shot at winning $10, 50% shot at losing $10. So why do things seem so different in the case of belief? Why do I feel so compelled to take the risk-averse option? Okay. So what I have concluded is that there are ways of caring about the truth which will motivate an aversion to forming beliefs in these cases, but not any old way of caring about the truth will do, as I just illustrated. So what I want to do now is convince you of two things. First, I want to suggest that the way that I think we, in fact, care about the accuracy of our credences has this feature, immodesty, according to which credences maximize expected accuracy relative to themselves. And then I'll explain to you why, if we care about accuracy in a way that has this feature, we'll be averse to belief gambles. Okay. So why do I think we care about accuracy in this way? So first, I'm sympathetic to an idea that Jim Joyce has been writing about in some of his recent work, which is that we discover, part of the way we discover the manner in which we care about accuracy is by looking at the belief-forming methods that we endorse when we're trying to get things right. As it turns out, a lot of the belief-forming methods that we endorse when we're trying to get things right, like being coherent or conditionalizing, are only going to be motivated by the concern with truth if our concern with accuracy has this feature, immodesty. Okay, so that's point number one. I haven't argued for that, of course. Other people have argued for that. We can talk about that during Q&A if you'd like. The second point I want to make is based on a result from originally Shervish, but that's been elaborated upon by Alan Gibbard and Ben Levenstein. And this is the idea that given the kinds of creatures that we are, it makes sense that we'd come to value accuracy in this way. So here's the rough idea. Creatures like us, our beliefs play a very important role in guiding action. And what these results show is that if you want to perform successful action, you'll want to value the accuracy of your credences in this way. Okay? Again, I'm happy to talk more about the details during Q&A. Okay, so I think that, in fact, the way in which we value accuracy does have this feature that credences are self-recommending. Why does that matter when it comes to belief gambles? Here's the rough idea. If I have a 0.5 credence, then I don't want to just jump around because credences are self-recommending. So if I'm at 0.5, I prefer 0.5 to being at 0.8. I prefer 0.5 to being at 0.2. As a result, I'm also going to want to avoid undergoing some chancy process, which gives me a 50% shot at this one thing I don't want, 0.8, and a 50% shot at this other thing I don't want, 0.2. So if credences are these self-recommending states, we have an explanation about why a concern for truth motivates an aversion to belief gambles of the sort that I'd be undergoing in these cases. Okay. Second meditation. Exciting news. I have decided to pursue a PhD in neuroscience. When I was in college, there was a lively debate going on about the way in which olfactory information was encoded. So some people thought that it was encoded by the spatial arrangement of the neurons that fired. Let's call that proposition S. And some people thought it was encoded in some other way, perhaps by the temporal sequence of firing. Let's call that proposition not S. Okay. So I was, in preparation for graduate school, I was doing some reading, and I was looking through some recent articles on this topic, and I found myself just being very confused. So some of the articles I read favored S, some of them favored not S, and the state in which I found myself in was one in which I'm what I'm going to call lacking an opinion about S. So here's what I mean by that. There's a definition. S lacks an opinion about some proposition P if it's not the case that S is more confident in P than in not P, It's not the case that S is more confident in not P than in P, but it's also not the case that S has a precise 0.5 credence in P. Okay. Some people think that states like this, you can represent my attitude using a set of credence functions instead of just a single credence function. And in the case of a single proposition, some people think my attitude towards a proposition like S can be represented by some interval, say, 0.3 to 0.7. Okay. So that's my current attitude towards S. It's this state of lacking an opinion. It involves not having a precise credence. And I have lunch with my neuroscience professor from college, and I'm asking him for some advice about which graduate school to attend. And I'm considering Columbia and the University of Arizona. And my professor says, let me tell you this. If you go to Columbia, you're going to end up being more confident in S than not S. And if you go to the University of Arizona, you're going to become more confident in not S than you are in S. Okay? This case is inspired from a case by G.E. Cohn and also from going to graduate school. Okay, so after this conversation with my professor, I think to myself, I'm going to do no such thing. I'm not going to form an opinion at all. After all, I just established the way in which I care about the accuracy of my credences. I don't like taking belief gambles. This amounts to a belief gamble. I think which opinion I end up forming is independent of how things are. It's just going to be based on which graduate school I go to. But then I realized that it's not so clear that the reason I was averse to belief gambles in the previous case carries over to this case. And that's because in the previous cases, the explanation I gave for why I'm averse to belief gambles appealed to this idea that I value the accuracy of my credences in an immodest way. That played a very crucial role in motivating this idea that I don't want to take a belief gamble. Okay. But now I don't have a precise 0.5 credence. In fact, I'm not represented by any credence at all. So the question is, can some similar sort of argument be given to explain why I wouldn't want to take a belief gamble in this case? So I believe the answer is no. So first, let me just make a very general point, which is that there are a number of results that show that there just is no good way of valuing accuracy of imprecise states, like the state of lacking an opinion, that has this feature. Okay. So there's no straightforward translation of the argument I gave for the precise credal case to the imprecise case because there aren't any good accuracy measures with this feature. But I want to argue for something more specific. What I want to convince you of is that when I'm in this state of lacking an opinion, L, there isn't anything about that state that suggests that it's better to stay in L than to become opinionated. Okay, and here's the way I'm going to do that. First, let's suppose that my state is represented by the 0.3 to 0.7 interval. Now, let's take some credence C that's greater than 0.5. And so I'm going to use L to represent the state in which I lack an opinion, and I'm going to let C represent the state of having credence C. And what I want to convince you of is that there's nothing about L which recommends that you better stay in L as opposed to moving to C. C is a credence above 0.5, so C is an opinionated state. So having shown this, I will have shown that L doesn't recommend against all opinionated states. Okay. Now, an unfortunate feature of this argument is that it's an argument by elimination. So what I'm going to do is tell you about different ways I've come up with of thinking you might motivate a preference for L over a random jump to C. I'm going to show you that none of the ways I've come up with work. So, of course, this has the weakness that I can't claim to have exhausted every possible motivation you might give. So this is the part where I'm hoping that maybe if you all have ideas about how you might motivate a preference for staying in L when you're in L as opposed to jumping to C, I'll be very interested to hear about that. Okay, 3 assumptions that will be in the background of my argument. The first is, I want to maintain immodesty for credences. I don't want us to give up on the idea that credences are self-recommending states. 2 reasons for this. 1, I think in fact that is the way we care about the accuracy of our credences. And 2, if we gave up immodesty for credences, we wouldn't even have an explanation for why to be averse to the belief gambles I started out with, let alone these more complicated cases. So let's not give that up. Second, I'm going to assume that L is not an accuracy self-undermining state. In other words, L isn't the kind of state that in every circumstances says, abandon me and go somewhere else. The reason I'm assuming this is that if L were accuracy self-undermining, anyone that cared about accuracy wouldn't find themselves in L to begin with, because L is never a state that they would want to enter into. So it becomes much less interesting to think about what an agent with L would or wouldn't want to do, given a concern with accuracy. Okay? And finally, I'm going to assume that L is the kind of state whose accuracy it makes sense to talk about. It makes sense to talk about whether L or C is more or less accurate in any given world. The reason for this assumption is that if it didn't make sense to even ask questions about the accuracy of L, then for sure there's not going to be any accuracy-based motivation for staying in L over C, because L isn't a state whose accuracy we can talk about to begin with. Okay, so those are my assumptions. All right, so here are some strategies you might use. So the first thing you might try to say, this would be a very ambitious thing to say, is to say, look, the reason that when I'm in L, I want to stay in L, is that L is more accurate than C, no matter how the world is. So this is a dominance argument. Whether it turns out that S is true or S is false, L is always more accurate than C. Problem with this is that if that's what we say, then C is no longer a self-recommending state. Because what that would mean is that even if you're in C, you should throw away C and move to L, because you think to yourself, look, no matter how the world is, L is going to be more accurate than C. Okay, so if we want to maintain that credences are self-recommending, we can't give a dominance argument for favoring L. Well, what if you said something like this? All right, maybe L isn't always more accurate than C, but I think probably L will be more accurate than C. Okay. Now, how accurate L and C are is just going to depend on whether or not S is true, whether or not neurons, the information is coded by spatial arrangement or not. So there's 2 ways things might go. Either S is true or S is false. Okay. So if you think L is probably more accurate than C, but it's not always more accurate than C, then you've got to think that in one of these cases, L is going to be more accurate than C. So let's just pretend it's this case. It doesn't really matter. So I'll represent that by just saying L greater than C. This means L is more accurate than C. Okay. And in this world, you don't think L is more accurate than C. Okay. Now, if you think probably L is more accurate than C, you're committed to thinking that this world is more likely to be the case than this world. But by stipulation, you lack an opinion about S. You don't think S is more likely than not S. So you can't think probably L is more accurate than C. Okay, so that's not going to work either. Next strategy. Can you say that L has greater expected accuracy than C? Not straightforwardly, because the expected accuracy of any doxastic state is always relative to some probability function. But in this case, when you're in L, you lack a probability function, so we can't calculate expected accuracy, at least in the normal way. Is there some way to generalize the notion of expected accuracy so that we can talk about the expected accuracy of different states relative to states like L? Well, one thing people have done is say things along these lines. Look, if every credence in your interval, if every probability function in your representer assigns greater expected accuracy to one thing than another thing, then we'll say that you assign greater expected accuracy to the one thing than the second thing. So it's a kind of supervaluationist approach. This isn't going to work either. We can't say that every credence in this range assigns greater expected accuracy to L than to C, because that would require that C assigns greater expected accuracy to L than to C. And if that were the case, then C would not be a self-recommending state. C would say, abandon me and move to L. But we want to maintain that credences are self-recommending. So this generalized version of expected accuracy does not work either. Okay. The last cluster of rules that I'll talk about here are rules like maxi-min, mini-max, and Hurwitz rules more generally. So the maxi-min rule says, make the worst case option best. The problem with this whole cluster of rules is that they don't depend on what your opinions are. So make the worst case scenario best is going to yield the same recommendation for what to do in general, regardless of how you think the world is. But if we want credences to be self-recommending, whatever rule we use to determine what credences to adopt must be sensitive to what the agent's credences are. Because what's recommended for the 0.6 agent has to be different from what's recommended from the 0.5 agent. The 0.6 agent has to say stay with 0.6. The 0.5 agent has to say stay with 0.5. So, I mean, this is just really to say about a whole cluster of rules. Any rule which is not sensitive to what your doxastic state is isn't going to be a rule that yields the result that credences are self-recommending. Okay, so that's where I am so far. So what I've concluded is that if there is any accuracy-based motivation for staying in L as opposed to jumping to C, it's not one that originates from at least any familiar, straightforward decision theory. So, having thought through all this, I found that my aversion to forming an opinion in graduate school dissipated. I said, look, given what I care about, given that I care about the truth, there's no reason for me to try to stick to L as opposed to letting an opinion be formed arbitrarily. Okay, third meditation. All of this meditating has been very taxing, and yesterday my friend Jane suggested that we go out for a drink. I said, Jane, I really shouldn't. I have to make an answer key for my logic class. But Jane can be very convincing, and before I knew it, I was at a bar, sipping a lovely glass of wine, as all of my concerns about beliefs formed arbitrarily melted away. I got home, I got straight to work, started working on my answer key for my logic class. I had just come up with what seemed to me to be a very satisfying proof that the premises given by this problem entailed the proposition P. When my husband came in and said, Miriam, please don't tell me that you're doing logic problems. You know what happens when you do logic problems in this state. It's happened before. You wake up in the morning and you find that only 50% of them are correct. You're doing no better than chance. After I heard this announcement, I started thinking, oh, geez, problem. And I started wondering about whether I should give up my belief that the premises entailed P. Okay. So when I was thinking through this, I thought to myself, look, in some respects, this case is similar to one of the first cases I started out with, the coin flip case. Recall in the coin flip case, I thought, if I form a belief, I'm only 50% likely to get it right. In this case, there's also some sense in which I'm only 50% likely to get things right. However, there is an important, or at least seemingly important, difference between the two cases. In that case, I was thinking, yeah, if I form a belief, it's only 50% likely to be correct. But if I ask now, having already formed the belief, is my belief only 50% likely to be correct? The answer is not so clear. If the perspective from which I'm thinking about this question includes all of the beliefs that I formed, then amongst my beliefs, it includes the belief that the premises entail P. And if the premises entail P, then it's not 50% likely that the premises entail P. It's certain that the premises entail P. So if I'm thinking about whether to give up my belief, given my concern with truth, from a perspective that includes the belief that I formed, then the answer is not going to be, well, it's 50% likely to be true, 50% likely to be false. The answer is going to be, look, I've got myself a true belief. Why would I want to give it up? Okay. So what I realized was that given that what I care about is the truth, when I'm deliberating about whether to abandon my belief in a case like the logic grading case where I've already formed the belief, what I'm doing is I'm engaged in doubt. And when I engage in doubt, what I'm interested in doing is deliberating from a perspective that doesn't take for granted all of the beliefs that I formed. So in this perspective, I set aside some of my beliefs, and I'm interested in whether those beliefs can be recovered from a perspective in which I doubt them. Okay. There's two ways we ordinarily recover a belief from doubt. I'm going to call it the first order way and the higher order way. So here's how the first order way goes. Suppose I leave my apartment, and as I'm walking down the street, I start doubting my belief that I turned off the stove. So I start thinking, did I really turn off the stove before I left the apartment? Here's one way I can recover my belief. I can think to myself, look, I remember that I cleaned the stovetop before I left. If the stove was on, I would have noticed it when I was cleaning the stovetop, and so I must have turned it off. Great. I doubted my belief. I recovered the belief using ordinary first-order reasoning. Okay. But sometimes that kind of reasoning isn't available, and we can still recover a belief once we start doubting it. So here's an example like that. I have the belief that my grandmother was born in Massachusetts. I don't have a whole lot of other beliefs about my grandmother's biography from which I can recover the belief that she was born in Massachusetts. But I can still think like this. Look, somehow or other I found myself with this belief that my grandmother grew up in Massachusetts. The best explanation for why I ended up with this belief is that some family member told me, and if some family member told me, then it's probably true. In this way of recovering a belief from doubt, I appeal to the very fact that I formed the belief as evidence for its truth. Okay, so that's another way. But in the logic grading case, once I subject this belief to doubt, I can't recover my belief in either of these two ways. I can't recover it using the first order reasoning. I can't recover it by just doing logic, because in this particular case, part of what I'm subjecting to doubt is that very reasoning. So I'm doubting the very tools I would need in order to recover the belief from doubt in the first order way. I also can't recover the belief in the higher order way, because once I start doubting the belief, given what I know about the circumstances, I don't take the fact that I formed the belief that the premises entail P as any evidence for its truth, because I think in these circumstances I'm no better than chance. Okay. What this means is that once I've subjected this belief to doubt in the way I've described, I'm going to think, look, if I maintain that belief, there's only a 50% chance that it's going to be true. So from the perspective of doubt, I think maintaining the belief amounts to a belief gamble. It amounts to doing something which gives me a 50% shot at the truth, 50% shot at the falsehood. I've already established that when I have a 0.5 credence in something, I don't like taking a belief gamble. So once I doubt the belief, the perspective of doubt says, abandon the belief that I formed. And having adopted this perspective and deliberated as I just did, I abandoned the belief. Okay. So that's what happened there. All right. So, okay, it's time to finally get to the cases that initially motivated us, the cases of religious, moral, political beliefs. So, take the following belief that I have a belief that I won't be reincarnated. And I know that had I grown up elsewhere, been subject to different influences, I would believe that I will be reincarnated. Okay, so call my belief that I won't be reincarnated NR. for no reincarnation. Okay. So when I find out about the social influences on my belief and the way in which it was brought about, I start subjecting this belief in NR to doubt. And once I subject this belief in NR to doubt, I start realizing that this is a belief that's very hard to recover from the perspective of doubt. Okay. So the reasons for this depend on the details of the way in which I doubt. Okay. So one question is, when I doubt my belief that NR, am I also subjecting to doubt a number of related beliefs? Like, for example, my beliefs about the reliability of various religious texts, my beliefs about the persistence conditions for a person, my beliefs about what's going to happen to my body after I die. Okay. In my own case, I find that once I start getting nervous about my belief that NR, I'm also nervous about this cluster of beliefs because I think that this whole cluster was brought about by the social influences that I'm getting anxious about. Okay. So when I subject this belief to doubt for these sorts of reasons, I find that I can't recover my belief that NR using first-order reasoning because the very reasoning, the very propositions I would need to appeal to in order to recover the belief in this way are also being subject to doubt. I also can't recover the belief in the higher-order way because given what I know about the circumstances, that I just have this belief because of where I grew up, I don't take the fact that I formed the belief that NR as any evidence for its truth. Okay. So, like in the logic grading case, I find that in the religious belief case, once I subject this belief to doubt in this particular fashion, I can't recover it using either of these methods. However, there is a third way in which I can recover the belief, in at least one sense of the word recover, which is as follows. I can think to myself, look, once I am in this perspective of doubt, once I've set aside NR and this whole cluster of beliefs, how confident am I in this proposition that NR? In my own case, I find that once I subject this belief to doubt, I don't have a precise credence in NR. I'm in a much mushier state, the state of lacking an opinion. It is worth noting, though, that it may recommend a reduction of confidence. So, for example, suppose in my ordinary perspective, I have a 0.99 credence that NR, but suppose that once I subject that belief to doubt, I have a 0.3 to 0.7 credence. Okay. For all I've argued, there may be good rules that say you can't be at 0.99 when you're represented by this range. You have to be somewhere in here. And so maybe a reduction of confidence will be warranted, but certainly it won't be the case that the state that I'm in when I doubt my religious beliefs is going to recommend being agnostic, becoming unopinionated. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? Okay. All right. So now it's time to talk a little bit about rationality, what you've all been waiting for. So far, I've done what I've told you I was going to do. I'm just like telling you how I've thought about things. And what I've done, like my basic strategy has been, okay, look at these different cases where we find out causal information about our belief, and then look what happens when we start to doubt that belief. And in this case, the perspective of doubt says abandon my belief. In this case, the perspective of doubt doesn't say abandon my belief. Okay. But there's this question you might ask, which is, who cares what the perspective of doubt says to begin with? I mean, so what if it's true that when I have some belief and then I doubt it, this perspective, which isn't my, primary perspective, recommends this thing? Like, what authority should that have over me? Okay. And I have not commented on that because, recall, my main aim is to give a demonstration of how to navigate certain doubts that you might in fact have. I tend to think doubt is just a thing that happens to us. I don't think that rational deliberation is going to tell us when to doubt and when not to doubt. I think sometimes we find ourselves doubting, and when we're doubting, we're very interested in what this perspective of doubt recommends. But you might be a kind of theorist who has certain substantive views, according to which sometimes the doubtful stance is required and sometimes it isn't. And what kinds of views you have along these lines, I think, are going to be determined by whether you're an internalist or an externalist, whether you're someone like David Christensen who favors independence or someone who's not sympathetic to independence principles. So you might have all sorts of substantive views that you can fill in here to determine when you're required to care about what this perspective of doubt tells you. And I'm just here to tell you what the perspective of doubt tells you when you think it's required that you care about it. Okay. All right, so let me just conclude. I think that beliefs formed arbitrarily are disturbing because they can't easily be recovered from a perspective in which we doubt them. I think that's what makes them worrying. However, I hope to have convinced you that at least in cases when in the perspective of doubt we're in this mushy state of lacking an opinion, there isn't anything accuracy-wise that can be said that privileges this state of lacking an opinion over a state in which we're more opinionated. Okay, thank you all so much.
Thanks. I'd just like to get a bit clearer about the initial characterization of beliefs formed arbitrarily. So, on at the top of the handout, there's a sort of characterization that the conditional probabilities of believing P and believing not P are independent of whether P or not P. So, one uncertainty I have about that is what kind of probability you're talking about, because I mean, suppose take some completely unproblematic proposition P that like there are some bottles of water on the desk or whatever. I mean, so maybe I have a very high credence in that, and let's say I'm absolutely certain that I have a high credence in that. So this would if we interpreted the PR as credence or as even evidential probability, it would just come out as this would come out as a belief formed arbitrarily. So we don't want that. And so you might go for something more like chance or whatever. But I'm not sure that your paradigms would actually come out as formed arbitrarily in that case, because for example, if P is some belief about that there's a God whose goodness pervades the universe, if we're thinking in kind of objective probabilities, well, if things had been different in that respect, probably whether I believe my beliefs might have been totally different, even, or maybe I wouldn't have existed at all, or whatever. And so it's a bit hard to get what the right kind of probability is. But the other thing is that quite often when you were characterizing beliefs formed arbitrarily, you were not talking about the insensitivity to truth, but sensitivity to the specifics of upbringing.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, that seems like a very different criterion. So, I mean, for example, suppose we've got some scientist who's just done a whole lot of research which conclusively overturns some folk prejudice. Yeah. Then, the fact that he did that research is super sensitive to his upbringing, and so if we use the criterion of being very sensitive to one's upbringing, then that would come out as a belief formed arbitrarily. So, I mean, do you have a canonical characterization, or is it? Should we think of this more as a kind of intuitive class that you're trying to characterize, but maybe without very much commitment to any one of these versions.
I do have some things to say.
Yeah.
I'll put it that way. So you're completely right that the characterization that I gave on the handout is inadequate for the reasons that you mentioned. So here's the real story. The real story is that I think we need to think differently about cases prior to forming a belief and cases once we formed a belief. So prior to forming a belief, prior to getting the evidence, I stand by this definition and I'm thinking of probability subjectively. So I think I haven't gotten any evidence, I don't have a belief, so in particular I don't assign 1 to I believe P. Then it's like the perceptual and logic coin flip cases, and yeah, my subjective probability in these cases is such that the probability that I believe the wall is red, conditional on I believe it's red, versus conditional on I believe it's blue, is the same. Okay, but once you form a belief, then that doesn't work very well, again, for the reasons that you mentioned. So the way I think about it is that whether you regard a belief that you already have as formed arbitrarily is always relative to some perspective in which you're doubting that belief. So it's only from the perspective in which you're doubting the belief that you regard which belief you formed as independent of the truth. And so I don't think that there's some sort of univocal answer to the question of, like, we look at someone and we say, is their belief formed arbitrarily, yes or no? I think it's more that once someone starts doubting their belief, having set aside some of these beliefs, they're going to have this subjective probability that I described from the perspective of doubt. Okay, and then the last thing I want to say is, yeah, you pointed out correctly that lots of times I was talking about sensitivity to certain sorts of influences as opposed to insensitivity to the truth. But I want to maintain the emphasis on insensitivity to the truth. Sensitivity to upbringing and so forth is only relative insofar as that makes you think that you're insensitive to the truth from various perspectives. So the scientist who performed this great experiment and only did that because of her upbringing, that's fine because she can think, look, even once I subject this particular experiment to doubt, I don't think that what I'd come up with, given that I had this great scientific upbringing, is probabilistically independent of the truth.
Could I just, a couple of comments. Two things. I mean, one is, the idea that it's very hard to classify these beliefs from the outside is quite surprising. I mean, so for example, if we took beliefs, let's say, about whether Barcelona is better than Real Madrid or vice versa. I mean, I take it those are beliefs that from the outside we can see are this have more to do with people's upbringing than anything else. But the other thing just about using credences in the state where you haven't formed a belief.
Yeah.
I mean, why shouldn't you just know that you I mean, if it's present tense, then why shouldn't it be that you just give credence 0 to I believe P and credence 0 to...
Oh, sorry. No, it's supposed to be future tense.
Future, yeah, so it's about what you will believe.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that... Of course, if it's about what you will believe, that it might also be sensitive to all sorts of stuff that you know about your own psychology.
That what?
Stuff that you know about your own
But that's the kind of stuff I think should be relevant. If the stuff you know about your own psychology has the feature that you think what I will believe is independent of whether P, then that's the kind of thing that should make you think I better not form a belief that P.
But I mean, it might be, for example, that, well, yeah, I mean, mean, there might be. It might be that you know that you're not. I don't know that you're on your deathbed. You don't know. You don't even know. You won't have time actually to put this into effect. Or I think there might be more interesting issues about the future.
I see.
Yeah. It just there seems to be there's a danger, with future tense things that will be kind of irrelevant interferences. But
I see. Okay, so can I respond to that? Right. So in most of the cases we're worried about in real life are not future tense cases. Though in the graduate school one, I think that is a real future tense worry. But in the religious cases and so on, it's more the present cases. And so there, what's relevant is this, perspective of doubt. And I just want to sort of echo what you're saying. I think it is surprising that these cases can't be neatly characterized from an external perspective. But I actually think that's the truth. So if we were to start getting into the mud of, in a way, Christensen's earlier paper, I think, is evidence of this. When you start trying to say, like, well, does this consideration count? Does that consideration count? Is that independent? Is that not independent? There aren't really clear lines here about what can and can't be appealed to. So the way my strategy has been to say, like, yeah, that's not a project that I think can be successfully done. But as a matter of fact, when we doubt, we're subjecting certain things and not other things to doubt. And that's the best way to make sense of these concerns.
So since immodesty is driving so many of the verdicts that you reach, I think there are a couple different strengths of the immodesty claim that you could endorse. And I think you use different ones throughout, or at least two. So I think the sort of the weakest version of immodesty just says that I shouldn't retain credences that don't consider themselves the best.
I shouldn't retain credences that don't consider themselves the best.
Right. So if my current credences seem to say that other credences would be more accurate, then of course I should switch. And that seems pretty plausible. And I think that's basically the argument that you gave for immodesty in the first place. But then, for example, I think in the second meditation, you seem to use a stronger version of immodesty, which says that no credence just looked at in the abstract should not recommend itself. And that was an assumption about basically how you measure accuracy. And I think that's stronger and maybe less plausible. And so is it true that you want to use both versions of immodesty? And then do you have a reason we should accept the stronger one as well as the weaker one?
I definitely want the stronger one, but I'm not sure I'm totally seeing the cases in which they're going to come apart. Because when I was saying, C better recommend itself over L, what I was thinking was someone that had credence C, it better be the case that being in state C doesn't tell you have to abandon C and move to L. So I was sort of speaking in a way that I thought was intended to encode what you called the weaker version.
Oh, okay, maybe. So just when I was looking at the pictures, I thought that the perspective of doubt was sort of like placing yourself at L or something like that. And then I thought you were trying to argue that if you're pretending to be at L, you're going to run into problems if you're considering all of the possible C's and what properties they could have, basically.
Maybe there is an issue here. So I was thinking, what you just said was right. So I was thinking, so in the perspective of doubt, you're in L. And then I was thinking, like, what kind of decision rule might tell you when you're in L, stay in L, don't move to C? And then I was considering different rules. And some of the rules I was considering had the consequence that if you're in C, you have to move to L. And I was thinking that can't be a good rule because we want to say any subject that's in C doesn't have to move to L.
Okay. But if it's for all C's... Okay, but I think then you still want the stronger one there because you want to say that no matter what C you evaluate, you want to assume that the C would recommend that you stay there, right?
Sorry, say that again? No matter what C I evaluate?
You want it to be the case that no matter which C you look at, C recommends that you stay and not move to L.
Yeah, but I just interpret that as for any C, if a subject has C, we want it to be the case that the subject isn't required to abandon C and move to L.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is strong modesty then, right?
Oh, I'm not sure I'm understanding the difference then between strong, because I thought the difference you were drawing had to do with whether I was making claims about what subjects should or shouldn't do versus saying abstract things about what credences do and don't recommend.
Yeah, exactly, because I'm thinking that if you want to say that no matter what C you look at, C has to recommend itself, then that's an abstract thing. Whereas it might be different to say that I should not personally, in the context of the story, retain a credence that doesn't recommend itself.
So is it the strong version to say any person with any credence, it shouldn't be the case that they have to abandon their credence and move to L?
I think that would be strong because
Okay.
I think you should be able to conceive of it should be possible that a credence doesn't recommend itself, and that would make it a bad one to stay at. And so if a person were there, they should move.
Oh, interesting. Okay. I have some more things to say, but I don't know what the... Okay. Well, just in terms of... So you asked... So if that counts as the stronger, then yes, I endorse the stronger.
Okay.
Then you were thinking, what are the motivations for the stronger?
Yeah.
So the two motivations that I described having to do with the practical implications of immodesty and it provides a good explanation for our belief-forming practices, those do appeal to the stronger. So yes, let me just say that. Those motivations they do motivate the stronger version of immodesty.
Okay. I'll ask later.
Okay.
I have a question or maybe a friendly suggestion of something that you might want to consider to add to your list of the eliminatory argument. And I was thinking that somebody who is a friend of the privilege of lacking an opinion state might think of something like the general rule that some like indirect connection with accuracy, that something like a belief that I have evidence for, or I think I have evidence for, is kind of, maybe that's not true, that it's more likely to be accurate. But like I at least have a reason to think that it will be more accurate than any other viable candidate that I have. So maybe that will be this kind of general linking principle, which seems plausible in the very general framework. Maybe it might be something that may motivate the defender of the privilege of lacking an opinion state.
Cool. So is the principle, if I have evidence for P, then I have reason to think P is true? Is that the principle?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So I take it I'm not sure how that would apply to L. Can you say how that principle would be relevant to the case when you're in L?
So, for instance, if you consider your belief and you discover that, in fact, you have no evidential support for your belief, then it's like kind of you have no reason to think that any credence is accurate, and therefore lacking an opinion is kind of the thing you should do, because other option, like you have no reason to believe that any other option is good, and given they are like many credences possible, so like the chance that you just hit it is can be quite small.
Okay, so 2 points. First, in the cases I described in which when you subject the belief to doubt, you lack an opinion, it's not necessarily true that in that perspective you have no evidence. You might have a lot of evidence, but you might also have evidence for the other side. So it might be a case where there's conflicting evidence. So there's nothing about the structure of the case that says you have no evidence for P. But I think maybe part of what you're pointing to is that we have a lot of sympathy for some principle along the lines of, if the evidence isn't privileging, you don't do any privileging. And I think that's really interesting that we have sympathy to that principle, but I think that it might be, I think it is the case that considerations of accuracy and truth can't motivate that principle. This is an aversion to sort of what you might call arbitrariness, and I think in lots of cases, concern about truth and accuracy do motivate that aversion, but they don't motivate that aversion across the board. So if you think evidence principles have to be underwritten by truth-directed stuff, which I do, then what you're going to end up doing is giving up some of those principles.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi. So this is related to some things that other people have brought up and things you've said in response, so I'm just trying to get clearer. So on the one hand, there's this kind of permissive aspect to all of this. On the other hand, there's also the kind of, well, in practice it leads to like sticking to your guns in certain cases, sticking to your original belief in cases where other people might have thought you shouldn't do that. And I'm wondering how these relate. So take like the fourth what you say about fourth meditation. All right. Mm-hmm. Understand this is like more biography than rationality, but just,
yeah.
So you're thinking that, wondering what's involved, what follows from the perspective of doubt, as you call it. So verdict, I'm not inclined to abandon belief. From the perspective in which I subject this belief to doubt, I lack an opinion about reincarnation. So I've kind of given up, I've bracketed at least my opinion about reincarnation, and presumably also there's this cluster, other things from which I could recapture that belief very, very quickly and so on. And then you say, this state is not one that recommends abandoning the belief that I formed. I'm wondering, is it also true that this state is not one that recommends against going for the reincarnation belief?
Correct.
Because then I worry a little bit, they're getting a little too liberal about this, right? Because here's something that seems to me that shouldn't be rational, just intuitively, is I start off believing not reincarnation. And then I start reflecting on, the cultural relativity of this belief and so on. And then I end up going for the belief in reincarnation. That seems to me like that would be some kind of rational mistake, right? I mean, just kind of, I didn't hold this belief to begin with. Then I start reflecting on this kind of belief is so culturally specific and so culturally relative. If I had grown up very differently than I had, maybe I would have it. That seems to me to, at best, mandate agnosticism. Maybe there's some case for conservatism, staying where I am. But to end up adopting the opposite belief seems to me kind of funny. And I was wondering if you think that if you think that would be rationally permissible, equally as good as sticking there. Is that something you think?
I do think it's equally as good.
Okay. Does it seem a little funny that these reflections about cultural relativity, you'd end up being a firm believer in something you never believed before you started reflecting on the cultural relativity of these beliefs?
I can report that I did think it was funny at an earlier point in time. So basically what I think happens in these cases is you subject this belief to doubt, and you're in this state of lacking an opinion. And the state of lacking opinion, it's kind of like, there's one way of thinking about it, which isn't, I think, exactly right, but it's kind of like things are sort of epistemically hopeless. And at that point, it's kind of like, do whatever. There's just nothing about that state that's like pushing you any which way. It doesn't say go this way, it doesn't say go this way, it doesn't say don't go in either of these ways, it doesn't say stay here, it doesn't say not stay here. And so once you find yourself in that hole, then a bunch of options are left open to you. And you can find yourself in that hole by realizing cultural relativity, blah, blah, blah. That can lead you into this extreme degree of openness from which everything basically looks the same. And so there isn't like it would be worse to believe this than to believe this. It would be better to suspend judgment than to believe either. That's the spirit.
Okay, let's think about that.
Just for further clarification, following right on Tom's point. So, suppose you go the openness route, the way you just said. So really they're all open. What makes any of them rational? Why do any of them count as rational belief?
So this is where there might be, I've kind of gone along with the various rational talk, but this is where some of my methodological preferences might play a role. So say we've all agreed with me up until this point, and there's this openness state. And then I think, you can say nothing is rational, everything is rational. What difference does that make? If they're all the same, then nothing is privileging this over this. At the end of the day, we're going to do something. Either we're going to suspend judgment, or we're going to believe, or we're going to disbelieve. So we can say you're irrational no matter what. It's a dilemma. We can say you're rational no matter what. But I don't care which we say, because I'm not going to do anything different on the basis of which we say.